Welcome to the SBCA podcast, Component Connection, where we explore the people, ideas, trends, and innovations shaping the structural framing industry. Regardless of how you touch this industry, we're glad you're here. Enjoy the episode.
I'm Sean Shields, Director of Strategic Partnerships for SBCA, and I'll be your host for this episode of Component Connection. I'm joined by Chris Rausch, an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin and director of the Enabling Technologies for Housing Innovation Center, or ETHIC. In this episode, we're going to explore the value of the Industrialized Housing Summit ETHIC helped host this past week in Austin. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Sean, thanks for having me on. It's good to see you. Hope you enjoyed your time in Austin last week.
Oh, it was excellent. It was hot, but it was a really good time.
Yeah, it's interesting because, just the week before we had highs in the 80s. So you got the full, as I like to say, you got the full Texas experience here. Highs in the hundreds last week.
We certainly did. Well, okay. So Chris, I want to start out by talking about, what was the opportunity and really your motivation to launch the Industrialized Housing Summit for the first time last year?
Yeah, so let me give a bit of the history on the Industrialized Housing Summit. So the summit is actually part of a HUD Center of Excellence that I lead here at UT Austin. And so the center started about 3 years ago. And the mission of the center is really to look at how technology can diffuse into the housing industry to bring about, affordable and attainable housing solutions. And so as part of this HUD Center, we've got some incredible partners of mine through ADL Ventures, who's really the industry-facing part of the center. We launched the Industrialized Housing Summit actually as part of what we proposed to HUD when we first got this center. And the idea with the summit itself would be kind of a bi-directional communication with industry. The idea would be that as we kind of develop research solutions, the summit would be a way that we could disseminate some of the findings that we developed through our research, but also probably just as importantly, the summit was also devised or designed as a tool to understand what the industry in return expressed as being the big opportunities as well as the big challenges when looking at industrializing production approaches to housing. And so that's the bit of the background. As you mentioned, we started last year. This year's event was the second time that we've held it.
So it's probably important on the front end here to define industrialized housing. So how do you and your group, how do you define that in the terms of this summit?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think that there is a lot of, working definitions for what we have established and kind of have come to use the term industrialized construction as a broad term. And so let me just unpack that, maybe very quickly here. I often like to also think that as an academic, definitions are very important. And so I perhaps maybe spend more time thinking about definitions than most folks, even when at the end of the day, we're often talking about similar things, but having distinction, I think does help kind of understand context. So industrialized construction really takes on the idea that we see in other sectors that have, made bigger strides in productivity and innovation, such as, automotive and aerospace. And in those sectors, industrialization was really a way to go from craft-based approaches for making things towards a manufacturing-based approach, which, is a very different paradigm. That paradigm shift goes from, one-off products towards systems of production that are inherently built on greater degrees of repetition, standardization, and ultimately higher throughput, more scalability. And so industrialization, we've seen it impact a lot of industries. It has impacted construction. It's probably inaccurate to say that construction is either industrialized or not. But what we really are trying to address with the term industrialized construction is that it is a gradient that we can continue to keep industrializing. And so in the context of construction, industrialized construction is a very, large umbrella term. And under that, you've got a lot of different technologies that can solve different challenges or may themselves have opportunities. So some of the technologies under this IC umbrella would be things like 3D volumetric modular construction. So having full 3D modules that build in a factory and ship to site. It can be 2D panelized systems. It can be component manufacturing. That's, of course, what kind of grounds our conversation here. But it's also other things. It doesn't have to only be in a factory setting. We see things like 3D printing that are highly industrialized, but the work actually takes place not in a factory, but predominantly on the job site. So I like to think that, a lot of what we're trying to, talk about across these different technologies, there's common threads. And so it's very helpful that as a center, we've kind of leaned into this idea that industrialized construction, as this kind of umbrella term, is a way to bring together a lot of different technologies and different associations together to solve very similar problems that we have.
Chris, you set this year's summit up with a lot of networking, a lot of one-on-one conversations, out in the hallway. The panels were excellent, of course. There were meals that gave opportunity for conversation. I mean, for you personally, after, listening in and helping plan many of the sessions, listening to a bunch and participating in a bunch of the one-off conversations, I mean, what do you come away from this year's summit thinking is the biggest challenge facing industrialized housing right now?
That's a good question. To be honest, I'm still unpacking that. I think there's, obviously so much happened in a day and a half. And I think, subconsciously, I'm still kind of categorizing things, but there's definitely a few themes that I think would be challenges in my mind. I think we made an attempt this year to have broader coverage of the value chain in housing. And what I mean by that is last year's event was great. We put the event together and we were able to get a lot of traction from folks that I would say are really on the supply side, manufacturers, people who are involved in designing things. But last year, we were really missing kind of the voice of the demand side. And I think we did a good job this year in kind of curating, better conversations. We actually started the whole summit with a really interesting conversation from military construction that I think points to this large demand signal that is, I think, a tremendous opportunity. I think throughout the course of these panels, we made good strides on trying to bring demand and supply in harmony. So that way we can kind of unlock, benefit across those. You need to have aggregation of demand and supply, but I think that still remains a big challenge that we're seeing, these stepwise, in some cases, they're very large stepwise, movements forward to bring demand and supply together. But I think that still fundamentally is one of the big challenges we have because not all demand can be solved by one unique approach. There might be a demand for, multifamily, and that multifamily typology may favor one of these technologies under the IC umbrella. I am of the belief that there's not one technology that's going to solve everything. I think there's a part for all, associations and technologies to play in what we collectively as the industrialized construction industry are facing, which is, I think we need to move away from, trying to compete against each other and find a way that we redefine the ecosystem. If we are successful at redefining the ecosystem, it's going to mean that collectively we can kind of address the default, which is conventional construction. It's dominated practice over the last 100 years. It leads to this like one-off project by project mentality. And so I think that is a big challenge, that we have. So on one hand, it's how do we structure demand and supply to work together? How do we, as a overall IC industry, figure out what this new ecosystem is going to look like? And then there's going to be also requirements on the business side. How do we figure out how to change financing structures and lending structures to enable us to, unlock the potential? How do we understand how we can drive costs down? There's this misnomer that once we start looking at innovation, we're automatically going to have cost advantages over conventional construction. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think we still need to figure out how we achieve these large cost savings so that we can ultimately drive down, the cost of construction to make housing more affordable. So those are a few themes that I think stuck out to me. I'm sure that there's more that I'll continue to unpack, but I'm also curious what your thoughts are. Like, what do you think to some of the challenges being, in the seat of SBCA?
Yeah, Chris, great job turning the question around on me. I appreciate that. It struck me in a lot of the conversations and listening to a lot of the panels, I was encouraged by, as you pointed out, the number of developers and building designers in the audience asking pointed questions. It is clear that there is a lot of interest in industrialized construction, and there's a lot of misperception as to what it delivers. And that cost piece is really, the crux. Getting the demand side to appreciate all that goes into providing, manufactured housing products, no matter where it is on the spectrum, right? From our industry, which is trusses and wall panels of floor trusses and that kind of thing, all the way up to volumetric modular. There's potentially a lot of steps in between those two for somebody on the demand side, a builder. And so we talk about the word disruption a lot, right? Builders are still building the way they do primarily because they fear disruption. They have a very robust and complex supply chain to get any building built. And so, as manufacturers trying to come to the table with a game plan for them of how they can implement more manufacturing into their process in a way that doesn't make them feel very uncomfortable, like they're jumping off a cliff and don't know if they're going to land. So there's awareness, there's education there. We need to continue having discussion like what we had at the Industrialized Housing Summit. So I think that was all good.
Yeah, thanks for the insight.
Chris, on the opposite side, like, what did you hear that gives you the most hope? Like, whether it was one conversation or just sort of a tone or mood, like, what gives you the most hope for this segment going forward?
I think there's a few things that, as I think through the challenges, I think all those challenges are coupled with, I would say kind of hope that I have moving forward. And so I think the first thing that, we really leaned into in our summit this year that I think was a very, dominant theme, we even talked about it in the closing remarks, is we have a unique opportunity right now where we have government-wide support to recognize that industrialized construction has this ability to unlock new opportunity, and that opportunity is, I think, really an opportunity across the value chain. So it's opportunities for developers, it's opportunities for designers looking at new solutions that have more, industrialized capabilities. There's obviously opportunity as well for manufacturers. And ultimately, if we get it right, there's opportunity for end users, people who are, trying to get into affordable and attainable homes, and so I think that the fact we have government-wide support to say IC is something that we are investing in. And also, I think there's very clear signals that government is willing to do what it takes to remove, I would say, conventional barriers. Some of the way that we've done things, I think, has been established for good reason. And I'm probably going to butcher this explanation, but it was like the success of Rome was not built on things that went well, but it was built on understanding failures. I'm sure a historian can correct me on that, but it's like we've learned over time, like how we bring about legislation and policy to I think fundamentally bring good. It's like, oh, something bad happens. Okay, so we need to figure out how to make sure that doesn't happen again. But I think over time, what has happened, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion here, we've kind of allowed a stack up effect, and we haven't been able to go back to the first principles and say, what if we revisited, legislation? What if we revisited regulations that have locked us? It's maybe kept us on a track that's been good over time, but now we've got a new opportunity to drive on a brand new stretch of road. And the old guardrails on that old road, I don't think they serve us well. I think we need to reestablish what the new guardrails are to keep us moving towards the target we want. And I think that the government has very, clearly expressed their willingness to help reestablish what these guardrails should be. I'm using an analogy here, but I think there's excitement that I have because the willingness to partner with industry is, I think, a very interesting signal that's coming from government that perhaps in different eras has not always been the case. There's been kind of more of this like, butting heads kind of approach. And so that gives me hope. The other thing is, as I mentioned, like this idea of reimagining the ecosystem where I believe everyone has a part to play. It's a big challenge. There's a lot of things that have to be overcome to reimagine this ecosystem. But I think there's this very clear willingness that we need to start collaborating together. And I mean, what I can attest to is last year's event we put on with like 6 weeks notice. This year we gave ourselves a larger runway, but like things, inevitably along the way that you have hiccups when you're playing an event. But it was just such an amazing feeling knowing that when people showed up, it was clear that they were here to take part in more than just like, here's my company's hope. I want to sell you a product, or here's my association. We kind of all put that down somewhat. And I think that really gave me a hope because it was an opportunity to say, okay, if we just take a cross section of the industry at large, if we work together, we can get a lot further than we can if we're just trying to fight our own fight, so to speak.
Chris, I think that's an excellent observation, and it's a great segue to sort of the end, my last question for this podcast. You and I have talked about this in the past, but given all of that, what's the value of having more component manufacturers, today's sort of mainstream industrialized housing solution, having more of a presence at the summit in future years?
Yeah, I'm really excited to help kind of grow this segment of our summit because as I have learned more about what component manufacturing is, I kind of knew about component manufacturing, but it was kind of like as a kid driving, I was looking out the back window of my parents' car and seeing, these roof trusses go together. And I never really understood, and I'm still understanding, component manufacturing, the way that, you've got an entire industry that is centered around a greater focus on productization than just this project mentality. And I think what's been clear as I've kind of interacted with SBCA over the last year is my perspective is that SBCA is in the trenches right now with experiencing and kind of feeling the effects of productization. I'm sure that you can attest to this where you've got, members that have ideas that if, could kind of, take off and go up the value stream and say, hey, you could make my life a lot easier if you just did these things during design to help productize, because then my parts would fit in better. If you did these kind of things upstream, from the early onset design, it would make me as a component manufacturer a little bit happier because then I could better integrate a higher degree of standardization. But along the way, it's more than just, I think, what would benefit SBCA members. I think that what you all have is familiarity with productization that can have diffusion up the value chain, that it can bring really large benefits that I think right now you guys are you've got this knowledge base, this institutional knowledge of understanding the effects of decision-making, of design, of manufacturing that I think needs to be brought front and center to other stakeholders. And so I really wanted to personally grow that base within the summit because I think there's a lot we can learn as a housing industry by talking to component manufacturers. And so I think, that's the biggest thing that I see. I think that they're also playing a very interesting role with the adoption of things like automation and robotics. So Sean, I brought you on a panel to talk about this. And I like to think that as we were planning that panel, that I actually stole several of your own ideas to help kind of orchestrate that panel because I think it was so valuable. What I think you brought to the panel specifically was this voice of, and I got it wrong in the summit, I said 13,000 members, it's 1,300 members. So I'm vision casting for the future of SBCA, by the way. That was what I was doing there.
Yeah, we'll take it.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, I think that we need to see, thousands and thousands of more SBCA-like members in construction doing, manufacturing. But the idea is that you guys serve this broad testing base, if you will, for solutions like automation and robotics. I will admit as an academic, I tend to think, the solution is throwing more innovation and throwing more, fancy toys at a problem and studying that. But I've come to realize that innovation is not simply by buying another machine, but it's really like there's something fundamental on the process side that is inherent. I walked through a component manufacturer's facility a few months ago, and what stood out to me, to be honest, I thought I would see more fancy automation, but I walked away with this real appreciation that y'all have figured out something on the process side that I think needs to be brought to the housing industry more broadly, because that's, I think, part of industrializing through and through. It's not, hey, let's bring more equipment, let's, bring more robots and automation. It's fundamentally a process thing that I think SBCA members know fundamentally that I think we need to diffuse that more broadly.
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Chris.
Is that pun intended? Hitting the nail on the head? Yeah. In the classroom, I have this thing where I build puns into things and I see who notices. And so I think you built that in purposely for me.
I did. You did. Thank you for catching it. And Chris, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives today.
Hey, this is fun.
I also want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of SBCA's podcast, Component Connection. If you enjoyed this episode and found it valuable, please like it, share it with others. Stay up to date and in the know by subscribing to Component Connection on whatever platform you use most.
Thanks for listening to Component Connection, brought to you by SBCA. If there's a topic you'd like us to explore in a future episode, email us at podcast@sbcacomponents.com.